I know you're surprised I'm not playing a Famicom game. Well, Fami Daily is now done. This is the after party. I didn't want to take away from Bokenjima 4's last Famicom game status, and one of the things I'm going to talk about is my absolutely massive backlog, so I decided to get started on that while I talked. With that preamble out of the way, let's get into talking about the world's largest first complete catalog of a system that has more than 1,000 titles. Yeah, you kinda have to split this one fine. There aren't many people who come close to the scale, thoroughness, and completeness of Fami Daily. I'm not trying to throw shade at anyone else. Any kind of documentation project like this is a huge undertaking. Other than Fami Daily, the only ones looking at a library of 1,000 games or more that are also complete are perfunctory. The ones about large libraries and go in depth are incomplete and tend to go very slowly. And the ones that are complete and go in depth tend to be very small libraries. And there's obvious reasons for all of that. Taking on a documentation project of this scale essentially means you're dedicating years of your life to it. You have to pick a compromise. Depth of content or duration of your time. And in case you couldn't tell already, I am going to be patting myself on the back a lot here. I just made over 1,050 videos on a system. Let me take my victory lap. All of this kind of goes back to the origins of Fami Daily. There's a lot of pieces that came together. First and foremost, I love the weird and obscure side of video games. It's one of the reasons I got into importing most of my games. It's way more likely that I'll locate something interesting that I didn't know about if I'm scrolling through a list of games on a Japanese store. And while it's unlikely that I'll ever find a masterpiece this way, it's not uncommon for me to find something that makes me go, oh, this is really neat. One of the things I was thinking about doing was a series of videos on games that nobody cares about. So obviously I was targeting internet fame right from the start. But there was another thing that I also enjoy, and that's chronological studies. No, seriously. Maybe it's the fact that I'm a comic book nerd, and that's a medium that likes laying out its structure in that kind of chronological line. If you read Fantastic Four number 1 through 600, then you understand Fantastic Four. I haven't done that, and that's because Marvel renumbered Fantastic Four in the 90s. But I did do a read-through of 50 years of it. It's not that I think a chronological examination is the only approach to a medium. In fact, I'd say it's often not the best approach. But chronology gives you perspective. You get into the granular differences, and you see the action and reaction that echoes through the process. The downside of this is you go through a lot of junk along with the important things. And that can't be avoided. You don't know what's junk until you've been through it. Like horse racing prediction cartridges. You show me one, I'll go, well, that's just garbage. But when there's an entire trend of horse racing prediction cartridges, you go, why? How did this come to be? Right before I started Fami Daily, I did a chronological read-through of every single comic published by Rob Liefeld's studio at Image Comics. There's a lot more of them than you think, and they're worse than you realize. But it was fascinating to dive into the worst excesses of 90s comics and dissect the whole thing as a train wreck. It starts with the moment of collision, and I could see every moment of breakdown as I progressed. I wrote up the whole process in a thread over on the Something Awful forums, and it's the kind of thing I've done a few times. Making a Famicom chronology was just a bigger version of what I had done before. And then there's the last reason I made Fami Daily, and that's because as somebody who liked importing their games, it's really hard to find information on a lot of them. Even on the Japanese side of the internet, these things are poorly documented. I decided that if I needed a reference for what every Famicom game was and how to play it, then I'd just have to make that myself. And that right there I think is the true value of Fami Daily. The chance of YouTube's algorithm pushing an episode will go away because it's no longer new, but there will always be people who go, what is this weird game I found? And for them, Fami Daily will always be here. There's a few games that, even with my low view count, I am still the most notable video on the game. Another one of my goals with this project was actually completing it, which I know sounds like a real, well duh, of course you wanted to complete it, But there's a lot of people who try to do something like this, only to have the project stall out somewhere in the middle. Again, that's not intended as an insult to anyone. This is really hard, and a lot of things can happen. Any kind of multi-year mega project is a big deal. It's just you see a lot of these chronologies that cover maybe the first 10 or 20% of their topic, and then just vanish, which inevitably means there's always a lot less information on later subjects. So I knew if I was going to do this, I had to finish it. And when I started, I was genuinely concerned that I'd do maybe 100 episodes and then be so worn out by it that I'd just stop. But my two strategies for getting this done worked. First, I drew a very hard, sharp line around what I was going to do. Commercially released, Famicom cartridges only. Mission creep can be a killer, and I defined my 1041 episode work list before I even started. Of course, that wound up being a problem because every single list of video games on the internet is massively flawed, so I had 2 cartridges that shouldn't have been on the list on there, and 3 cartridges that should have been on the list taken off. I should have listened to the Famicom Complete Guide Deluxe, which told me that there were 1042 cartridges, but at the end of 2000 when I was in my planning phase, I hadn't yet realized how much more reliable that book was than any other internet source. The other big strategy to make sure I completed things was the name, Fami Daily. By being daily, I reduced the possibility of scope creep again. I couldn't take 3 or 4 days to complete a video on a game. It had to be one and done. It also meant I had an endpoint set in stone. November 7th, 2023, I was done. It also meant that every day I had to make at least one more video. If I didn't make one video, then I was risking not getting done. I did take some very rare days off, and there were plenty of times where I had to deal with something in life, and so I couldn't make a video that day. But for the most part, no matter how good or bad my day was, rain or shine, healthy or sick, I had to make at least one episode of Fami Daily. There were a few times that I had problems that might have shown up in a video, like when I was hit by a car, or when I suddenly went almost completely deaf. If you noticed a lot of additional car or pet sounds in the backgrounds of some videos, that's why. I am better now, thank you. No matter the circumstances, Fami Daily had to get done. That's also why I finished my work on Fami Daily on June 20th. I maintained a massively deep buffer because I was terrified that something would happen where I wouldn't be able to make episodes for an extended period. Going forward with future projects, I'm not going to do quite so much. The biggest work is done now, but we'll get to that in a minute. Of course, the downside of choosing speed was that I couldn't be as in-depth as I wanted to be, something that especially hurt genres like RPGs and strategy games. I never could give Koei a fair shake, but that's the trade-off. I could either go fast and have a pretty good shot of getting it done, or go slow and significantly up the risk of stalling out in the middle. At least that was a trade-off I accepted going in. And just because I was going fast doesn't mean it felt fast. A typical episode of Fami Daily was about 5 or 6 hours of work. I know when you're watching those 6 minutes it goes by fast, but unless there wasn't a whole lot of variation in the game action, it was a fair amount of effort to edit everything together. That means Fami Daily was a second full-time job for me. It was a lot to work through. One of the most important things I did when I started out was starting. Again, a bit of a tautology, but bear with me for a moment. I kicked the concept of Fami Daily around for a long time before I started. Like 4 or 5 years long time. And if I had done it when I first thought about it, this would have been a very different project. I didn't even have the full set of Famicom games when I started Fami Daily. Most of my video editing experience had consisted of adding subtitles to Game Center CX episodes, but I dove in and learned as I went. Yeah, you make mistakes that way, but if you don't do it and make those mistakes, then you're never going to make any progress. Looking back over the whole project and thinking about what I'd do differently, well, there's a few things. First, I'd probably set up a nicer background than that black void. I considered adding a masked background and cleaning it up a little bit, something that would give the viewport on the game closer to an actual TV view. But by the time I was thinking about it, I was already pretty deep in, and I didn't want to break things up. As it stands, I revised my hardware and software multiple times over the course of Fami Daily. In the end, I wound up using a RetroTink 5X, feeding into a Pile capture card, and I edited everything in a copy of Vegas Pro that I got in a Humble bundle. Not all the best stuff, but I got a workflow that works for me. I do wish I had changed video editing software sooner. I was relying on crossfades because in games, the music and sound effects repeat a lot, so a hard cut between clips could be pretty jarring. Unfortunately, the first video editing software I used did a terrible job of crossfading the audio. That took me a long time to figure out how to address it. I also spent more time than you might realize trying to improve the video quality. Turns out the RetroTink 5X is getting a firmware update that will clean up a lot of the weird artifacting you sometimes see. It's just coming a little bit too late for me. Another thing I do differently is I think I'd loosen up a little bit. I was always pulled in two directions on that. I didn't want to be someone who just made wisecracks about the games. But when one of my primary purposes is just explaining what the game is, well, that can be a bit dry. I do think it was the right choice to avoid breaking format very often. It was fun to do on occasion, but if you're always breaking format, then you don't have a format anymore. There are plenty of episodes where I wish I had given the game a bit more recording time. Not usually the RPGs. Another hour there would mean maybe footage of another town and a few more monsters. But there were a lot of games where I might have struggled to get to level 3, and then I just ran out of time. And playing a bit longer would have given me some more varied footage. The way I scheduled things, though, I really could only do extended recordings on the weekends. One thing I learned as I progressed that I wish I picked up on sooner was that I didn't need to be so hyperactive in my editing at the beginning. For a long time, I felt like I had to illustrate every single sentence, and eventually I realized that I wasn't adding a whole lot by doing that. And chopping things up too rapidly meant you didn't really get a view of how the game played. So I wound up trying to stick to longer cuts. I also found that trying to get fancy with the camera wasn't really adding anything unless I was illustrating something that might be difficult to view. Which is why I settled down with that after a while. How about a few more behind the scenes things? The easiest episodes to make were the bad ones. If I had an awful game, I mean a truly awful game, that gave me something to focus on and use as a through line for the video. And if all the screens in the game look the same, then I could edit those episodes super fast. So all of those baseball games were easy to do. Or at least easy after I got over the hump of figuring out something to say about them. Speaking of baseball, I really don't hate baseball video games. It's just that to me, they're kind of an inert lump. They're there. I really can't work up the energy to care about them. And then the Famicom just has so many. At least the Mahjong games, I could try to learn how to play Mahjong as I went. And if you go back and watch all of the Mahjong games in Fami Daily, you might notice that my playing improves a lot. But the games that I genuinely hated the most, I mean truly hated, were the Sugorok games. Those were miserable. If I was smarter, I would have taken the rapid-fire controller and rubber banded the button down. But I was always trying to keep an eye out for something weird or goofy that I should add into the video. Sugorok reminds me a lot of the Royal Game of It's a board game that spread all throughout Eurasia about 5,000 years ago, and it seems it was the most popular board game in the world for about 3,000 years. And it's awful. On every turn, players roll a die, move that many spaces, and if their token lands on another player's token, then it gets sent back to the start. But players have 7 tokens, and the board is only 20 spaces long, so statistically the game flattens out. It's effectively a 50-50 coin flip for who will win, and it takes a long time to play out to find out what the result of that coin flip is. By the way, this is the type of digression that I cut out of Fami Daily all the time. I told you, this is my victory lap, I'm being self-indulgent. Sugorok was so common on the Famicom, and I hated it so much, that as a memento for completing Fami Daily, I bought a Sugorok board. It's a reproduction of a 19th century one, and I think I've used an image of this exact board a few times in Fami Daily episodes. The spaces represent the 53 stations of the Tokaido as well, so that's both a callback to a Famicom game, and a reference to some nice art. I actually happen to have a few prints from Hiroshige's series on my wall. Shinagawa, which I've actually visited and there's only a plaque there now. Yui and Shono. I think my favorite games to play during Fami Daily were the puzzle games. Those also wound up being a bit of a pain because every stage looked the same. So much of what I was playing were either action games or games where I just had to mash my way through, that a game where it engaged my brain a bit was always a nice change of pace. A problem that came up for me as I was making Fami Daily was that all of my resources tended to dry up around 1989. Magazine advertisements just became either the box art or screenshots. Manuals stopped having custom art in them. They weren't making a lot of TV commercials for Famicom games anymore. And a lot of Japanese resources were all really focused on the boom era, basically 1985 to 1987. It was like once the PC Engine came out, the Famicom became the machine that everyone preferred to ignore. It kept going thanks to the huge size of its install base, but it really became a machine where people went, oh yeah, that exists. Or of course the hand-me-down to the younger brother, which is why the last couple of years had so many games targeted at very young children. Couple more things I wish I had. A few more peripherals. I actually have a turbo file finally on the way right now. By the time I found an affordable one, I was already past most of the turbo file games, so I just didn't bother. But there were also some wild peripherals for the Famicom that I really wanted to show off. Well, maybe we'll get there at some point. I considered getting an RGB blaster, the RGB out that functions off of the Famicom's cartridge port, but I just missed the first wave because they sold out instantly, and now that they're regularly available, they were coming in so late, I decided to stick with my format. Something I was considering doing for the Famicom 40th anniversary was ranking all of the Famicom cartridges. All 1,042 of them. Fortunately, I gave myself a sanity check, and I backed off from that one when I did the math on how much work it would take. That's when I decided to tell the story of the Famicom in 40 games for the 40th anniversary. But if you're curious, the bottom one would have been Toshiro Masashi no Princess Gai Pai, and I went with Super Mario Bros. 3 for the top spot. Honestly, I don't like ranking things that much, and with 1,042 games, a lot of the positions I set up were pretty arbitrary. It would have just been an opportunity to run through the Famicom's library. I want to thank everyone who posted a comment to a video, not because it helped Fami Daily with the algorithm, I never cared about that, but because I genuinely liked hearing from all of you. I didn't reply as much as I could, mainly because I was always making videos, but I read all of your comments, and I loved getting them. It also always made me smile when somebody started responding to early videos, and I could see them work their way through the episodes of Fami Daily. So just to thank a few of the people, thank you Marius Amber, An Actual Mother Bear, Awesome Panda LPs, Carlo Zulueto, Ofek, The Real Quinn Zach, Marcos Mota, and so many more. If I didn't mention you, it's just because I didn't want this section to go on forever. Thank you, everyone. Now to one of the big topics at hand, my backlog. As a collector, my backlog has always been big. I spot a cheap copy of a game that I might be interested in playing, I picked it up. And when it came to importing things from Japan, well, after I selected my big purchases, if I couldn't spot any cheap Famicom games I didn't have yet, then I'd pack the box with whatever else I could find. And none of that stopped while I was making Fami Daily, even though every drop of free time was gone. I did eventually finish Elden Ring, by the way. It was the only game other than Famicom stuff I was playing for 6 months before I beat it. So even though one of the minor goals of Fami Daily was to get me to actually play my Famicom games, that backlog hole has been dug awfully deep now. I'm not joking when I say I have got a literal cubic meter of games that are completely unplayed and waiting for my attention. I'm not going to add the ones that I've played for 10 minutes and decided that I'd go back to later. Part of the issue is that I do happen to like in-depth games, so I pick out longer stuff to play, and then really couldn't get around to it. By the way, the game I've been playing in the background of this video, in case you forgot the title because it was on the screen 20 minutes ago, is Dungeons & Doom Nights. a homebrew NES game that I bought from its creator at Midwest Gaming Classic. It was created using the NES Maker software, something that, now that I have some free time again, I might actually dip my toe into. But let me get back to talking about the rest of my backlog. A few of the more interesting things from it. I've got an Amiga 500 Mini that's still in box. I want to actually give European games a bit of a fair shake instead of just making fun of them all the time. Even though they deserve to be made fun of, I mean their most popular game stars an egg. I've got the vast majority of the Pop-In Music series. I'm not really good at it. It's just that one of the things I'm always looking for in video games are the unique experiences. And Pop-In Music is definitely one of the unique experiences. Maybe the biggest thing in my backlog, literally, is a copy of Gloomhaven. Though for that, I'll have to find a few more people to play with me. I have a genuine problem where, because I spent 3 years focused entirely on the Famicom, there's a lot of stuff where I just don't remember that I have it. And one of the big things I'm going to be doing is cataloging my collection properly again, especially the Super Famicom and Game Boy games. I also happen to have a ton of games in that backlog that are set aside for future videos. Which brings me to, what do I do next? Well, first of all, there's still going to be daily videos through the end of the year. I have the libraries of 2 systems that are historically important counterparts to the Famicom, and I'm going to do daily videos on every game in those libraries. That doesn't quite fill out the rest of the days of the year, but I have a few more videos to fill that out, including a follow-up to a Fami Daily bonus episode, and a collection tour, though that's going to occur after I've had a chance to reorganize everything. And 2024 is going to be the year of the FDS. There are 197 Famicom Disk System games, and I'm going to space out episodes for that across the entire year. So a little bit more than every other day. A lot of that will overlap with Fami Daily episodes, because about 1/3 of FDS games were Famicom games as well, but we'll dig in there. Beyond that, I'm not really planning on any more big cataloging projects, so no Super Fami Daily, no Game Boy Days, spelled with a Z of course, no PlayStation Crash. If I was to do a cataloging project, I'd want there to be a reasonable chance of it getting done, and after Fami Daily, I'd have to turn something like one of those into a 10-year project. I don't think this would be complete if I didn't talk about YouTube. And yes, I recognize that the perspective of somebody with a microscopic channel doesn't really mean a whole lot in the scope of things, but I've done a lot and I think I'm entitled to my perspective. I made a point with Fami Daily of not really pursuing YouTube stardom, and put some heavy air quotes around that stardom. I knew Fami Daily would never be able to be popular, but beyond that, my feeling is that if you start trying to work the algorithm, then you're not doing what you want to do. It's one of the reasons why I don't do any monetization, I don't have a Patreon, I don't even tell you to like, comment, and subscribe. If you want to make money from a system, then you wind up having to play that system. I'll never begrudge anyone who's trying to make a living doing this, or even trying to make enough to cover their expenses. It's just, I didn't want to spend my time trying to chase viewers. Now, if someday the YouTube algorithm happens to bless me, cool, everybody wants to get their stuff seen. But I don't need it. When I make a video about one of the strangest PlayStation 1 games that I'm aware of, that no one has ever beaten, seriously, it's a fascinating train wreck of a game. And I expect some of you who showed up for Fami Daily content probably won't want to watch it. And that's cool. I'm still glad you watched my Fami Daily videos. I know YouTube punishes content diversity, and I don't care. I just want to talk about some of this stuff with people. Or I guess 2 people, since this is a video. I'm going to close out this already too long video with a little bit of my thoughts on retro gaming and video games in general. Why do I prefer to play old games? Well, it's not really nostalgia, is it? I mean, I'm not nostalgic for a gimmick, but I'll play that all day long. The thing that I enjoy in video games is the novelty, and I think I even said that earlier in the video. Games that show me something new, games that do something different, games that give me some interesting new gameplay. Sometime around 2004, 2005, I noticed that a lot of the high-profile games were no longer doing that. And in fact, over the next few years, the entire video game industry kind of became one mess of homogenized slurry. Now, I don't think that's the case anymore. The indie boom of the 2010s has given us a whole fresh injection of new ideas, and a lot of people copying those new ideas, but that's something that's always happened. I found that the games that did something different, that tried to experiment, sometimes successfully, sometimes not so much, were often in the past, back when people were just trying to figure things out. And so I started seeing what I could find that I had missed before. Also, I started playing a lot of board games at that point because people were really starting to experiment a lot there. Of course, games they released in the US were really well documented, but I realized there were a lot of games released in Japan where there just wasn't a whole lot of information out there about them. And so I started importing them and trying out new things. First on the PlayStation 3 because you could do that just by changing an account, but soon enough I was importing for all sorts of systems. And I always loved finding something new. For example, do you know how many Kicks games there have been? Unless you're an obsessive weirdo, I'm gonna guess there's at least 3 you don't know about. And one thing I tried to avoid in this process was just dismissing a game out of hand. Looking at it and just going, this is stupid. Games are an interactive medium. You can't just look and decide. Hopefully I've been bridging some of that gap by explaining what the games are, but in the end, you're not going to know what your reaction to a game is until you've played it and made an attempt to understand it. Except Euro platforms. I'll always make fun of Euro platformers. There are 1,000,001 ways for you to play these old games now. My preference is collecting them, and I like to play on original hardware, but even that has trade-offs beyond the financial aspects. Like the shimmering that occurs because the comb on my TV set is so tight. Yeah, the shimmering you see in the video, I see on my TV set too. But whether you're emulating or using an FPGA device, or playing a remake, or like me, using the real hardware, there's no wrong way to enjoy these games. Except stretching them to fit the entire size of your screen. That is an abomination. The important thing is that you're playing them. That's what video games are for, interacting. For engaging with you directly. I know there's an awful lot of people these days who prefer to consume this media passively. And I think that there is some value in that. But games are meant to be played. Get out there and play them. I hope that Fami Daily introduced you to something new that you'd want to try out, and then you went and did it. Knowing that happened would make me very happy. Okay, I've rambled way too long here. Another important thing about Fami Daily is I always kept it short. Not just for the sake of production time, but because it was important to streamline what I was saying. And I haven't done that here, so I'm just going to stop myself short, and I'll just say, see you next time.